What do you think? Does Mistborn live up to the Sanderson hype? Hey everyone, and welcome back to Reading Crossbow. My name is Lana, and I'm here with Rob.
Hi, everyone, and I'm excited to talk to you about your book, Lana.
Yeah, this was a good one. I was, as you know from the last episodes, I was super nervous because, this is a throwback for me. It's a book that I've loved. Spoiler alert on how I'm probably going to rate it. And so having you read it was a bit fearful, but hey, we got a lot of subscribers actually from the last episode.
Yeah, and wanted to kind of just thank everyone for joining. The last two episodes, which both referenced Mistborn, have actually done really well. So it's kind of exciting to see where this is going.
Yeah, so Mistborn's popular enough. Thank you, everyone, for coming here and stopping by and subscribing. I mean, we had to pick out a couple more popular books. No more of your recommendations, I think.
Oh, I think you're wrong there. But
I know. I'm just digging.
but definitely, Mistborn has definitely shown up, and I know one person specifically mentioned Gunmetal Gods as being their interest.
Yeah, I saw that in the comments. That's super cool. We love when you leave your comments. It helps a ton to see where you all come from. So definitely getting new subscribers from Mistborn, and also I have to say, I know I dug at you earlier, but Warhammer was a big one as well.
Yeah. So far, two best videos so far. So I'm excited to get into this and see how your latest read of this book is. Has maybe you had some rose tinted goggles?
It changed, but first I'm going to describe the show to anyone here that might be new. So here's how we do this. If you caught Rob's episode last week because you're new here, that's a halfway episode. So whenever we refer new books, whoever referred the book, the other person does a halfway review. So that's what Rob did last week. And then we get together and then we do our combined review. We try our best to do no spoilers. Halfway episodes always have no spoilers, and we'll let you know if there's any in the full episode. And so the episodes where we both review, whoever referred the book, which was me this time, does this kind of interview style. So I come up with the questions. They're usually about the same. And then I interview Rob and get primarily his feedback. And then we discuss together, rate the book. We also have a Show Me the Map where we discuss maps in the book because we believe maps are really important in fantasy books. And then we also talk about crossbows, if there's crossbows in the book. So we'll get to that. But first, we always do a quick summary of the book. I'm not going to go as deep into that this time because Mistborn has been around. I think it was printed in 2006, been around a long time. A lot of people know about the book. There's even discussion that there's going to be a movie. So quick summary, this overall is actually a heist book.
Heck yeah.
Yeah, I know. We know Rob loves those. So I picked well. And where a band of criminals of all people with allomantic abilities or magic decide to overthrow the Lord Ruler. And the Lord Ruler has ruled this world for 1,000 years. And there's different class types of people: noblemen, those with magic abilities, and the Ska. The Ska is basically like the worker class group of people. And there's also orders to this society. So there's a ministry, and the noblemen have some sort of part in the order as well. So it's quite complex. The magic is quite complex, but at its heart, this is a heist story.
It is, and that's actually the best part of this story is it follows some very classic heist tropes that I'm just in love with. I love those kinds of stories, especially all the twists in the story, and then, oh, well, we knew that was going to happen all along.
And, that's what I think that I didn't know when someone recommended this book to me. I didn't realize it's a heist story. So you have magic, you have some romance, not a lot. It is Brandon Sanderson. And you have a heist. And then complexity. And so that's what we're going to kind of dive into. We're going to quickly talk about areas of the book that we do in every episode, which is usually the characters, the general storyline, the setting, and of course the magic system. And then we rate those separately, and then we rate the book overall. So I'm going to jump right in here. We're going to go straight into it, Rob.
Okay.
And I'm curious, with this band of criminals, what did you think about the characters?
I thought the characters were great. I think they were well described. All of them had a very diverse personality type. They were all kind of playing to a stereotype of a member of a heist type team, a con team. Um, it's arguable. I think that you could say that they were on the shallow side. The characters, most of them didn't go too deep, but the book really did attempt to kind of spend some time with each of those characters and let them show you the world from their point of view. Now, they did that through our main point of view character, Vin. Vin, I mentioned in the last episode that she is an amazing audience surrogate character. I think that was extremely well done. Even though she's fully lived in this world, she's not lived in the heist world or the high society world. She's always been far, much lower on the food chain. And so she's able to be well explained things. And I think that's really great because it limits the exposition. So the exposition is normally the yawner part of a book, and having a really good audience surrogate character really kind of allows you to communicate that information without having it feel kind of boring and a long stretch, a slog. And so I think this book did that extremely well, where it just kind of flows very naturally as you learn about this world with the characters.
Yeah, I loved that part, and I didn't really realize it until you explained it that way in your halfway episode. But Vin is wonderful because she has some magic but doesn't know it, and she calls it luck. And that's kind of cool. And because she thinks it's something else and she's just like lucky, then she has to have someone explain it to her. And that's because she's ska, which is that kind of lower class I was talking about earlier. She doesn't have access to, all this education really. And so, yeah, we learn through her, which is amazing. And he's able to explain the magic system, which is incredibly complicated and we'll get to later. But I love that you zeroed in on Vin. I think she's wonderful and she really only gets better throughout the rest of the books. But, did you have a favorite character? Was Vin your favorite, or was there another one that stood out?
I mean, I think Kelsier really stands out as kind of being an easy fan favorite. He's definitely written for like a 13-year-old boy's like power fantasy. He is he's a great character, and especially as a power fantasy, is terrific. He's the man with the plan.
That's a good way to put it. I listened to the audiobook this time since this is the throwback for me. And what's funny is listening to the audiobook, you get a different perspective of Kelsier when someone else is like talking for him. And
Yeah.
so Kelsier for me was completely different in this one. And in the first book, because I was reading it myself, I think I glazed, sorry, not the first book, when I actually read the book, I glazed over the fact that like Kelsier was like blonde and tall in my mind because he's such like a dark kind of he's happy, he smiles all the time, that's one of his characteristics, but he's kind of broody in lots of ways too because he has a dark past. So I just pictured him your typical movie dark, broody, dark hair, and when I was listening to the book, it was like Kelsier with his tall, good looks and blonde hair. I was like, wait, what? So yeah, the audiobook's definitely different for listening to the characters. But yeah, I thought the characters were great, and there's a lot of them. And I got that too when listening to the audiobook. Is the narrator chose to make some more British sounding and some others not, and this criminal crew of misfits, sort of. Or it's not that they're misfits; they just all have different kind of magical uses that we'll get into. But they all sound incredibly different, and I think they did a great job with that. So,
Yeah.
the narrator and the author.
I agree, and I think all the characters in general were very well described out as far as they had kind of distinct personalities. The way they kind of banter and bicker amongst each other kind of just shows that it really projects that long-term friendship amongst these characters. Um, and that works really well in this kind of a story. So, the characters as a whole were very distinct and interesting, even if you didn't really get the time to spend with each one of them.
Yeah, there's a lot, definitely. So we are going to jump into the setting now.
Yeah,
Where these characters, where this heist, plays out. So what did you think about the setting?
I think the setting has a lot that hopefully will be described in future books. Um, there's a lot, or so there's a lot of unique things about this world, ex- aside from the magic system. Like it's constantly raining ash, and there's this mist, the namesake of the book, um, that really is not really delved into. It it feels like in this book it's a missed opportunity. That, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's actually key and critical in future stories because there's still two more books in this trilogy. But the setting itself, I mean, for the most part, we don't get to see it. Almost the entire book takes place in just one city, and mostly in a single build, one of three buildings.
Yeah, it is a pretty vast world, and we get that more as they start to travel. Yes, this first book is mostly in Luthadel, which is where the Lord Ruler lives, and it's where the noble houses are. And there's several noble houses, and they're basically when they're trying to pull off this heist, they have a key crew member, it's actually Vin, who has to infiltrate the noble houses. So she goes like ball to ball to ball to ball, and that might sound boring, but it's actually where a lot of the interest happens, and we dive into some of the other characters. But yeah, it's all in Luthadel. But we're getting, I think, the base, and I feel like I'm cheating because I've read the other books. But like it gets there. But yeah, it's mostly all in one place, and you could like pick up a kingdom from most any other stories you've envisioned and plop it down in this story. Throw a bunch of dirt on it because there's ash mounts everywhere. Plop an ash down and mist.
Yeah, and it has a very industrial revolution London feel. I've mentioned a lot in the past about where you feel like a city or a country has been brought into a book to kind of quick explain a setting. I'm saying London here not to do that. That's just kind of the best description I can give about this setting is it just has that kind of a feel. It's almost industrial. You have a lot of workers in the city, a lot of ash, which would definitely be industrial London, and and then a crazy rich aristocracy, lording over everyone else.
I think we should also bring up too that because of these ash mounts and because it's raining down ash, the world looks very different. So you can't really picture it our world. We sometimes try to say like, is this our world? Is it like an Earth planet? We don't really know. It could have been, but there's no lush green plant life. There's none of that. The ash mounts with all the ash in the air, these are basically volcanoes, block out the sun for the most part, and the greenery can't thrive. So even the plants are brown. They can't harvest many. What's been able to thrive and break through over the last thousands of years isn't like even overly nutritional. So the noble houses can grow better, like crops, just because they can house it, like just for themselves. Even they have ska that work on plantations, but it's all brown, it's all gross, it's like not pretty. So it's a very ugly, super grim world.
Yeah, yeah, and I found that specifically to be the most challenging for immersion, just because like one of the characters has never seen a flower, and it's like you kind of need those for most plants.
Yeah.
Um, but that character spent almost their whole life in a city, and therefore, it's arguable like at that time at industrial London, most people inside the city might not have ever seen a flower. Or at least some people.
Well, this is right up your alley. It's very dreary, but we'll move away. So, I know. We'll move away from some of that. I think it's a great time to do Show Me the Map, which we normally do later in the show.
Yeah.
But we're going to do this early because the map's not overly complicated in this book.
So we are working off of different editions of the book, but we kind of checked earlier, and we very much have very similar maps. So at least through the 10 years between our editions, it's probably it's the maps stayed pretty good. So
Yeah. And there's two. We get a map of the final empire. And the map includes Luthadel, the city where, this particular story takes place. The ash mounts, which are interesting because there's more ash. It's more dreary if something is close to an ash mount. And then the other regions. And then we also get, help. It's very helpful. We've mentioned this before in other books where they give you a giant map. I think actually this happened in the Priory of the Orange Tree, where you get a world, but we don't get the actual city that they're in most of the time.
Yeah.
So I found that nice that we actually get the city map.
yeah, and I think the city map is probably the better of the two maps for what I like in a map, which is a very useful map. It helps explain to the user the setting, and help them visualize, what's going on. What about you? Which map did you prefer?
Well, I definitely like the Luthadel map better. I will say it's a little bit boring in my opinion, just because it looks like a normal city map. We've had maps that are a bit more fun when they show a city map, and I believe the last one that was like that was the Sword Catcher, if I remember right, where they
Yeah.
put buildings on it. Like if they're like, it would be nice to have like House Venture on here and have it like kind of look like House Venture, have where their hub is, where they meet up for their secret meetings, the band of criminals, and have that on here. So I think it's missing that. But
No.
other than that, I mean, it's just straightforward. I don't think we need to spend a super ton of time on this map. It has everything critical. It has everything that you need. I didn't reference it one time. I'll say
No.
that.
So what I found to be interesting is all the gates are actually the 8 metals.
Yeah.
And I found that to be just an interesting tidbit. I mean, the city really, once again, it kind of has a London type of a feel to it. And for the most part, I think it was a good map. Yeah, I didn't use it heavily. However, the other map, the world map, I absolutely hated. I think this.
Oh, we have some hatred. Okay, all right, we have Rob back.
So the book very clearly tries to explain that the final empire is functionally a world empire. Like it is controlling at least the majority of of at least a continent. That's how it's explained. And yet, this is a tiny little corner of a continent. And yet it tries to give this feel that this is a world empire and the entire world worships the Lord ruler. And this map actually opposed what I was being told, unless what you're being told is a lie. And the majority of the world is not under the thumb of the Lord ruler.
Okay, so I have to just not say anything here because I've read the other two books. I will say they get far out of the central dominance. So, but I don't think still that goes outside of this radius. Like thinking ahead, where they go when they get outside of the central dominance, there's areas that they spend a lot of time in, and I don't think it's outside of this bubble. So I think that you're right. And that makes me critical now. And that's too bad. That's too bad because Brandon Sanderson, I would hope, with his, I don't know, you know what? Sanderson has a central dominance over the writing world, okay? He has so many books out. Like, he can do better maps. Like, this is cool looking. Stylistically, I think it's cool, but I don't think it makes the best representation. But outside of these two maps, I was actually sad that it doesn't have a guide to the elementic metals, because I remember the first time I read this book, I actually went online because I was starting to get confused. We'll get into the magic later, but I was getting confused which metals did what, and it's very important what they do, that I actually remember writing it down on a little piece of paper and sticking it in here so that I could go backwards, and that would have been very much needed. I don't know if it's in other editions. I have no idea. Maybe someone could tell us below, but I would have much rather had that than have these maps, and we love maps.
Yeah.
Well, that's it for the map. And I actually just realized that we didn't rate characters earlier. So, since it's fresh in our head, we just did the setting and the map. We'll go back and do the characters, but map first. How would you rate this map? One
I
to five.
I think this is three. There's nothing special here. The maps are fine. They're helpful, but um, nothing really special for me on the maps.
Same. They were functional, stylistically kind of cool. They weren't, they didn't get in trouble. They didn't do anything wrong to warrant less than a middle of the road. So three for me. Setting for what we got in the first book. How do you feel? How would you rate the setting?
I think the setting definitely feels very unique. I mentioned London earlier, but in no way does the book really imply that like other books we've read. So I feel this setting is extremely unique, even if I wish there was more explained or more experience of that setting. So I'm gonna say this is a four.
Okay. I give the setting in this book a three. And that's mostly because it is so dreary to me. I don't think it explains enough in this book. We do have plantations, we do have ska working to get food, but I just have a really hard time understanding how this world with nothing feeds this massive city. It's massive. It talks about it in the book.
Yeah.
It's huge. So uh
And
unsure.
I would agree that I have some suspension of disbelief issues with stuff like the food. Um, but
Yeah.
but like I said, I still feel like the setting is very interesting and detailed out in a way that I'm excited to learn more about.
Yeah, I think that for me comes from the writing style, where you mentioned a flower earlier. One of the characters carries a picture from it's old, it's crumbling, of a flower, just to like, hey, this used to exist, and he shows people, and they're like, no way. And I think that's really cool. But I think that's less the setting as it is like the writing style, which we'll get into later. So for me,
Sure.
it's a three. But happy to see you give it a four. And yeah, big blunder on my part forgetting to have us rate the characters earlier. But how would you rate the characters in this book?
I think the characters are extremely likable. Like you wanted to learn more about them. Um, each one of them kind of has a bit of a backstory, even if the heist team, you don't get enough time with them. So I would say this is above average. So I would say four. I liked
Four.
these characters.
Awesome. Yeah. I give it a five. I love this book. The characters are well described, and this was very apparent to me with the second trip around, like I talked about, listening into it in audiobook, because I had a better mental picture, even though I got Kelsier wrong.
Okay.
I think of the characters. I feel like I built them stronger in my head, which meant reading them, I was able to build up that picture. You know how important it is for me. So, and I liked like one of the characters isn't as important. He's like the person that kind of hides the Allomancers, and we'll talk about how that works later. And I know that he has a family that he hides outside the city, and like really deep. They went decently deep into his character for someone that even doesn't show up like all that much.
Yeah.
He likes to like rip the sleeves off of his clothes because he likes his big arms to show on it. Like it's just cool stuff like that. I think is really cool. Another character. So yeah, I give the character development a five here. Also because one thing that we mention a lot is, would we be sad if any of them were to die, leave the story, something bad were to happen to them. And we this Mistborn does have some of that where, characters get affected. And without being spoilery, I'm just saying it happens. And then I was quite sad for a character that something bad happens to. And so, yeah, five for me. But that leads us into the writing style, which I kind of talked a little bit about when we were talking about the setting. But I mean, this is Brandon Sanderson we're talking about. He's written a lot of books. I myself am very excited to read the Stormlight Archive, which I have not yet read. And I know you've read some Sanderson, particularly, I know you mentioned The Wheel of Time. He wrapped up that series, which is interesting that he took that over. So very established writer. Mostly the same kind of genre, in this kind of like sci-fi / fantasy. But he does jump outside of it a bit. But what do you think? Does Mistborn live up to the Sanderson hype?
So he writes in a very modern style, modern language style. And what that means is he uses a lot of words that were based in more of a Latin base word, heavy use of French or Spanish base words. Whereas like the more flowery text you might expect from like someone like a Tolkien or something, they use a lot of Germanic language. Um, and like I said, that's like Tolkien and Rothfuss. They're very heavy use of that kind of word base. And whereas Sanderson is using essentially a very modern language. And so it makes it very easy to read, but it's also not very descriptive or exciting. There's not a lot of flowery text, the kind of analogies or that I traditionally kind of really love. It's just not there in this book. How did you feel?
I agree with that. Um, he, I wasn't sure that that's what I was interpreting when I was reading it. I think of it as like accessibility. This is so easy to read, like ease of read. But I realize now that it's modern writing, as you say. Like this, there's just no, like we're taking place. Like if I had to picture this in my mind, you say like industrial London, but I still think of like your 1800s when people would talk sort of like, with a more sophisticated tone, use different words for things. And you don't get any of that. It could be written as if they were walking through today's world, but they're clearly not, after we went through on the setting. But I find that accessible. And I think that's why he's probably a very popular author, is it's very, very, very easy to read his books. There's no like, what did they say? There's no rereading it. There's no like, oh, wow, I love that metaphor, as you say. And I don't know if it's just this group of books or not, but I mean, it doesn't get any different in the next books. Like he stays this course of writing style. Yeah. So, but I actually like that for this story. And I think the reason why is because it's so complicated. When we get to the magic system, our viewers will see like how complicated it is. It's not just the magic system though, it's the class system. It is the heist, how intricate it is, having to remember the different key players in the story. Inquisitors add a whole level to this with the ministry. Like it is complex in general what's happening, that I think if the writing style were overly complicated for this story, it might be too much. Not that I'm saying I wouldn't still like some of that, but it's probably what makes this so accessible.
Yeah, and I think by using a less flowery, writing style, you're actually able to convey more story in the same amount of words, because you're not spending, 10 words describing something that in this book would have described in 4. It just allows for more story to happen in the same amount of pages. So that's a trade-off, and that's a preference thing.
So how would you rate that?
So for me, my preference, I would probably lean towards, I would want more that flowery language. So I would actually put this, I'm not going to say it, I absolutely not going to say this is bad or even okay. It's good. So this is a 3. This is, it's solid. It's easy to understand. There's nothing confusing. I, I'm often looking for more. But that doesn't mean this is bad. This is just average. Or and I don't even want to say average. It's just good. It's good.
Yeah, that's fair. It's really fair. I'm going to rate it higher. I agree with you in general, but some things, like for example, when we get to rating the full book, sometimes we rate it higher just because of how it makes us felt. So I'm going to rate the writing higher just because like the creativity behind all this, building this world, building this magic, thinking all of this up, which is maybe partly the story, but I think without the writing style being what it is, I think it would be much harder to understand what's going on here. I think it needed to be simple. I think he recognized that, and that might be a stylistic choice. Again, I haven't read more Sanderson, so I don't know. So I'm going to give it a 4.
Okay. Sounds good.
But that takes us to my favorite part. We're finally here. The part that I've been waiting for. The magic system. Please don't disappoint me, Rob. I can take it if you do. But we love talking about magic systems on this show. We've had a few of them. And I want to hear what you think about the Cosmere, this section of the Cosmere, because I know it changes in other books a bit. We get into more magic types. But in Mistborn, what did you think?
I think the magic system is beyond a doubt extremely unique. I don't think I've really encountered a magic system that was this distinct in the way it's written, the actual rules behind it. Um, the magic system is extremely almost limited, but that's intentional, and it actually encourages the characters to have to be creative in how they use the magic. So just to kind of explain, um, you consume a little tiny bits of metal, and you can power a magical ability. If you consume iron, you can, I think, pull um, magnetic things to you. If you consume a little bit of steel, you can push them away from you. And then you have other abilities where you can, I think, copper allows you to hide magical abilities. Tin allows you to see really well. Um, pewter allows you to be really strong and have supernatural toughness, and all of that's extremely just very interesting. I liked that. I I think if I was making this like for a role playing game, I probably would have made some different choices, and it has to do with. I think there were some cool things with the magic, and I mentioned it in the last episode where um, essentially there's four normal elemental metals, and then you have the four alloys of those metals. And it's like that just seems very limited. Like there's a whole bunch more metals out there. Let's use them. And then when you do alloys, it should be like merging those two powers together into something new. I think that would have been cool. But, you know, for this story, I'm not going to criticize the creativity of a very unique setting. So I think it's cool. I it is very cool.
Yeah, and to clarify that more for anybody who's new here or new to Mistborn and considering reading it, like you have, I thought the alloys were weird too. I will say that because I thought, why not just use pure metals? It doesn't make sense to me. And I also thought the alloys would give like properties of each other. It just doesn't. But like, so each ability, so like there's like strength abilities, as you mentioned, there's abilities to impact emotions, someone's emotions. And so the pure metal, I can't remember which one is pull and which one is push, but basically whichever one the pure metal is either pull or push, and then its alloys the opposite one. So there's two different sides, so flip of the coin to each magical ability. So I think that made it sound very, very interesting. Because you can push emotions, you can pull emotions, and those are like soothing ones, and then there's like enraged ones, and that's a different kind of metal. So different things like that, and very interesting, and different allomancers. So we should also say in allomancy there's mistleans, which are people who can do one, and there's mistborn, and these are people who can use all of the metals. But in general, mistborn are very, very rare, and mistleans are still rare. You have to be basically an offspring of a noble person, which is difficult. And so basically we have all these ska who actually are allomancers. So basically all these noblemen out there are kind of like, going behind their wives, having fun with their ska slaves. It's terrible, really, but they have these, illegitimate children, and that's how we get the majority of the allomancers in the city.
Yeah, at least the allomancers within this book, because they are almost exclusively ska that have powers. Now, some of them were raised as maybe noble, secretly, but it's very interesting the way this works. Now, I think one of the benefits of I mentioned earlier that there's some drawbacks. It's very limited powers. So that what excites me about that kind of a magic system is that it requires the characters to be very creative in how they used it. Like, yeah, you can push metal away from you, so you can hold up a coin and shoot it away from you like a bullet. That's pretty cool. Except that's not enough. Like, what more can you do with that? And so, like, dropping a coin on the ground and pushing down on it it can't go any further into the ground. So instead, you get pushed up in the air, and that kind of gives you almost like a jumping or flight type power. That's a creative use of that ability. And even if you have the opposite of that, where you can only pull things, you can pull metal to you. You can pull metal to you, step out of the way, and zing it on by you, almost like the person who pushes metal. So you can almost, you can do almost the same effect, but in a reverse order, and that's really cool. Like there's a lot of neat elements to this.
Yeah, and that's apparent in the fighting scenes in particular with the Mistborn, who come across as being able to fly. Like people kind of would think that they can fly, but they actually can't. It's just like a very intricate use of the magic system, and one that I think is incredible creativity that Sanderson came up with, that they're just pushing and pulling off different metals and doing it so quickly where they're pushing off this metal, which kind of shoots them one way, and they're pulling off this one, which shoots them another way. And so it kind of can make them hover/fly if they do it fast enough. And so I just thought that was neat. Like no one has the ability to fly, which would be an amazing kind of superpower, which we'll get into in a minute. But they do have the ability to sort of, abuse isn't the wrong word, but creatively use their powers to do cool stuff. But what's also neat about the Allomancers is that if you're not a Mistborn, any single power on their own or magic on their own isn't that strong. Like there's Tin Eyes who can see really far, but like together they're better, which is why we have these kind of bands of thieves, or they group together to do things, because they need, a smoker to hide them. A smoker can use their metal to kind of hide out the activities of the Allomancers in their group. So on their own, if they're not a Mistborn, they're not as strong, except for those who could actually make themselves strong, but either that's limiting as well. They kind of are almost forced to band together to, use all of their resources, which reminds me of I think I've said this in an episode before, but like Captain Planet back in the day when we were growing up. I mean, a lot of the younger audience won't understand that, but they had to join their powers together, right, to make Captain Planet, which I thought was cool. So, I mean, this sort of works the same way, but I had an important question for you.
Okay.
You bring this up all the time, and it's really made my mind kind of, which is this magic or is this superpowers? Because in comic books and in a lot of other superpower shows, sometimes they drink something or they take something to make themselves stronger, to make themselves have an ability. So the fact that they're ingesting these metals, would you call this superpower or magic?
In the past, I would have said superpower, and it's not because they're ingesting the metal, it's because it's genetic. They're born to this metal. Like,
Okay.
but I've been looking into just the magic versus superpowers. And I mean, it's arguable that every superpower system is just magic, just like advanced technology is just magic to people who don't understand it. That's a reference to Arthur C. Clarke. But you know, I mean, I genuinely really like magic systems that have, you know, oh, I say, abracadabra, and the thing happens. I make the right finger gestures, I say the right words, I have the right intent, and the magical effect happens. I'm an old D&D player, and I like that kind of magic. But that doesn't mean that this isn't magic. Um, it's just a different kind of magic.
Okay. It's interesting for me to hear you say that, because I feel like we've been doing this a little over 6 months now. We're past our halfway point, and you've started to convince me that some books aren't magic, they're superpowers. And after going the second time on this book, I'm like, oh my gosh, I say this is like the best magic system I read. Is it really superpowers? And I feel that way a little bit with the Allomancy. But I thought this is a good time to bring up that there's more than one type of magic in this book. So, and the big ones, there's three, but so there's more. But like in this book, we get Allomancy, which is what we've been discussing, and we get Feruchemy, which is very different. And it's only in a certain region, and you can find that on the map. It's the Terrace region. And these individuals, these people who possess this, which is there's not many of them now, are different. So the magic's kind of already inside them. It exists in them. And they can take that and they can sort of imbue it or put it in metals. So we still have metal. Metal's still part of this. And they have like pewter rings and gold rings and things. They still have all the metals. And you can store strength in a pewter ring, just like how someone who's strong can ingest pewter. So it's kind of a reverse way to do it. The magic's in them already, and then they put it in the metal. Whereas the other one, it's in the metal, and then they put it in themselves. So this magic system, again, this is why I kind of go back to the writing style being simple, I think is fine. Because Furukami is, when that comes up in the book, is crazy interesting. And I'll spend just a couple more seconds on this, but like the person that they focus on that has Furukami, like if he wants to be really, really strong, he has to take strength from himself and store that in a bracelet, which basically means he's weak for several days. Or if he wants to have better sight and store that so that he can have basically like a tin eye where they can see really far, then he has to go several days with bad sight. So they like take from himself to store this. So, Furukami, Allomancy, tell me about those two powers in this book and what you thought.
So what's really cool about the setting is that it's a consistent concept. Even though it's being applied very differently, I like that there's this you know, so there's an argument like in Game of Thrones that all the magic you see in the books really is the same basic magic. It's soul magic. It's operating on the soul. And I feel that way about this one, where it's all operating on metals and they're operating in very, you know, uh, rhyming type of ways. You store strength in pewter, whereas the allomancer gains strength from pewter. So these ideas kind of rhyme between the different magic systems, which suggests that there actually is a kind of super magic system that's above this, that they're only seeing a part of these magic systems based on their heritage, because this is all heritage based. So you're born with it or you're not. And I find that to be, kind of challenging in this kind of a story. It's kind of cool if someone can just teach themselves or learn to be great, um, rather than, oh, just the great people are born great.
Well, I have to be quiet on one more thing. I'm like, I want to tell you, I can't. So there is another type of magic that comes from metals, and it's sort of teased in Mistborn. So I think it's worth it that we bring it up right now without spoiling anything, because I'm not going to dive too deep into it. But there's also hemalurgy, which
Okay.
is what we see in the Inquisitors, and you kind of got that because they have metal spikes through their eyeballs. And that was something you would have known in the halfway. And then as you start reading further, I'm not going to say where, but you end up finding out that they have more spikes in them. So this metal is like driven into their bodies. And it's not going to explain it in book one. We know it exists in book one. We don't know what it's called.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of giving that away. It's called hemalurgy, and the Inquisitors have it.
And I guess, does it also operate on similar metal based things?
It does.
Okay. So
So metal's the same.
and that's really cool. You can also tell, there are different variables of power. For example, Vin, because she's been using it since a very young age. She's exceptionally good at magic, or at allomancy, more so than the other Mistborn in the book, who gained it at a much later age. She's almost a natural talent. Technically, they should be the same, but she's just been using it even subconsciously much longer than the other character. And she can actually seemingly has abilities beyond what even that character has. And probably due to just she's actually more experienced despite the fact she hasn't been actively using the powers as much.
Yeah, she's had a catastrophic thing happen to her that we can say happens. You have to read about it. And this impacts her, and it comes out more in some of the other stories. But so, just in one magic system, in one book, and there's more books, we get allomancy, ferukami, and hemalurgy. And they all still play together. I like how you said rhyme. I think that's super cool. It's a great way to describe it. And so for me, this was the most complex magic system to this date that I've read. So I think this is the point where we should rate the magic system. What would you say this is, 1 to 5?
I mean, I think I'd have to say it's a 5, substantially on its depth and uniqueness. Not a lot of books really spend the amount of time to be this distinct. And now I don't want to necessarily say that, oh, Sanderson's hard magic system is the only way to go. I don't feel that way at all. But having something that feels very unique and that's exciting. And I love that this book has an extremely unique system. And even where it feels limited, that's a bonus because now it allows the characters to be creative in their use of these powers. And that's super cool. So I'm gonna have to say this is a 5.
Yeah, I mean, no secret here that I'm gonna say 5, so I'll just say that right up front. But I wanted to dive into a why a little bit, because we've talked about all kinds of magic. And so for the new viewer here, I mean, there's all types of magic, and I'm probably gonna miss some here, but we have like divine magic that's come up on our show, soul magic, as you just said earlier, runes, elemental magic, which happens to be my favorite. We have death magic in a book that I found recently, which we might do on the show. I'm not sure yet. And so there's just a lot of types of magic. And so since I like elemental magic the most, I tend to dislike spell magic the most. And then when you take a subsection of magic and then you have someone explain it and go like, oh, but it's really this, instead of like in your like Warcrafts or something where it's like, I call upon water or wind or whatever, but someone's saying how is like, oh wait, that's neat. And the only one that I've seen do that outside of this book is Shadow and Bone. And that Grishaverse does an incredible job of explaining, kind of using the elements and really diving in deep to it. And so that's close, but I think, I mean, that came out after this. So I'm wondering, sometimes I wonder if those borrow from this, but it was done differently. So I would love to see on our journey here on the show and magic systems, finding an author who does what Sanderson did with elemental magic, with, I think spell magic is kind of done in a bit, but like with even divine magic, with dark magic, with chaos magic. Like I want to see complexity be born from some of these other systems. So yep, 5. I'm excited. I loved this. And there's actually no spoiler. There's another thing. I'm just gonna say there's another thing when you get through these, allomancy, ferukami, hemalurgy, and then something else. So it's coming.
Okay.
But this leads us to story in general, which is kind of where we're gonna wrap up with how we rate the different sections of how we rate the book. So just kind of quickly, in general, the story, how did you feel about Mistborn?
So I think I was challenged by this book insofar as there's a lot of what feels like hurry up and wait in this book. And while it's good to have for a book to have, some spots where you can catch your breath and maybe just absorb the setting, um, this one was kind of the opposite. The kind of the real exciting, interesting spots. And I'm not talking about just the action scenes, but the really interesting bits seem to happen in very short, like a few pages, and then you have a long gap between them where it's mostly just character building and character development, and that's good. That's good too. But it does make for a weird kind of curve to the excitement within the story. I do think actually that there is a style here that I picked up on. Um, so the other kind of Sanderson series that I previously read, which is called The Reckoners, it's a superhero very much the boys type of story. Um, and the first book in that is called Steelheart. And Steelheart and this book, if you want to talk about rhyming, those two books very much rhyme. And they do something that's fairly uncommon in fantasy books. Um, Most of the time, the end of this book would be the end of most trilogies of books. And that's the case in The Reckoners as well. Steelheart ends in almost the very similar way to Mistborn. And so if you read the two books, you'll understand what that means. But the two books proceed in a way that's not common for a first book in a trilogy. And that's actually, I like that. It's a novel, unique kind of thing you don't see a lot of.
You said rhyme earlier, and now as I've been thinking about it, I think like harmony or harmonize is another good way to put it. And so I feel like, this book and its magic system does that. I'm curious about that book that you've mentioned now. I mean, I've heard you mention it, but I haven't read it. But like this book for me, the story started off slow. I will say that. Like it had definite slow moments. And I think building up this world and building up this magic system was just quite the task for Sanderson to set this all up, and it just needed to happen in the first book. I think that's an unfortunate side effect of knowing you're writing a trilogy. Like he knew he was writing a trilogy, right? It wasn't like you write a first book, it does really well, and you're like, I'll add on to that. Like this is clearly prepped. And if you've ever seen, some people are going to hate this, and I'll probably hear about it in the comments, but that picture of like the horse drawing for Game of Thrones,
Yeah.
where it's like this, gorgeous horse drawing and it gets weird and wonky. I don't love part of the third book. I won't say which part, don't love it. And that's where we get your kindergarten lines drawn on the horse, so to speak. Hate it. I think the first book had to walk so the second book could run. The second book is incredibly interesting. We get a bit more of like the love interests happening. We get more into the magic. We have a magical, cool moment that happens. Is amazing. And then the third book, although also gorgeous horse drawn for part of it, it just, everyone interprets it differently. I've heard people say they just love the third book, but like, I think the most important part I got to say about book one is, did it make me want to read book two? And I distinctly remember actually being on vacation, actually to where Brandon Sanderson lives, Salt Lake. Actually, it was in Salt Lake for my daughter's birthday. And we had like a 2-night stay in a hotel. And at night, I was just pouring through it, trying to finish it up. So I got through the first book, and then I could not wait to drive home. It's like a 5-hour drive to my house from Salt Lake City to get the second book. And I remember thinking like, because how this ends, which we can't say, I was like, oh no, oh my gosh. And I had to pick up the second one. And so because of that, for me, this story hinges between like a 4 and a 5 if I couldn't wait. It would be a 5 if it was that much of a feeling longer, but it's not, because it is very slow at parts.
And I feel like that's the book almost, because it's trying to be very detailed. Like one of the things, the main character actually gets the arguably most boring job as part of this heist. Each person in the heist team has a role that they have to do as part of the heist, and yet this character spends the majority of their heist activities going to parties. And it's like
Gathering secrets.
yeah, and while that is actually critically important to the story and actually is good for the user or the reader, so they can help understand the setting and the dynamics of the setting, it's not the most interesting part of that story to me. And my favorite parts of the story was normally wherever Kelsier was being awesome. That's probably the parts I enjoyed.
Absolutely.
And
Same.
so it's a fun story, and I'm glad you actually got me to read my first Cosmere book.
So I'm giving it a 4 because it was slow in parts out of what I think could be a 5, but it's a 4 for me. How do you rate the story?
So I would say yes, it's definitely on the 4. I what I need, the difference between a 4 and a 5 for me is like an emotional connection. And I really didn't get that in this story. But this thing is, the story is still, it's better than good. This is a great book, and it really has interesting characters and unique ideas that are being told. And this is terrific, and I'm glad we got to do this.
So we are now to rating the book. So in this section, we pull up books that we've read in the past on the show and how we've rated them. And so now we get to see where this book falls. 1 being just bad, and a 5 being like the best it can be, and our 3 is good. Where would you put Mistborn?
So for me, I definitely feel like this is above average. This is definitely a solid 4 for me. I didn't have that deep kind of emotional connection that I really wanted for a 5, and I think that largely has to do with the characters. Um, our main point of view character is very closed off emotionally, so it's hard to get deeply attached to them. And the other characters, we just don't get enough time with them. But that doesn't, it's still a great story, and I think it's one that most people should. If you're a fantasy reader, you should read this. This is a great fantasy book.
Yeah, really good fantasy book. And when I'm reading it, I have to actually remember the first feeling of reading it because I did not enjoy the audiobook as much. And I'm just not always an audiobook person. That's fine. Little warning for those who decide to read the audiobook. There is like I forget what they're called, but it's like a blurb before each chapter, which is like an excerpt from an old text. That is done at the end of chapters. For the next chapter instead of like reading it at the beginning. So when you finish like a chapter, you're going to get the blurb from the text for the next chapter at the end of the last chapter, which is really weird, I think, because if you're just reading it and flowing into the next ones, it's no problem. But let's say that you ended on like, I don't know, chapter 20 and you're going to start chapter 21 tomorrow. That little blurb at the beginning of a chapter gives you some context about the chapter you're going to be in. So I felt like that was really not done well, which is frustrating. And I had read the book first, so I knew where it was supposed to appear in order. It's very odd. But yeah, I have to go back to the feeling of reading it the first time, which was like, I could not wait to see what happens next. I was blown away by the magic system. I can agree I was not blown away by Vin at all times, just because, I don't know, I come from the YA world too, of like, intense, strong feelings, and she is not always intense. Like, and I want her to have like intense feelings towards her love interest. I feel like that's where Sanderson fails. He does not do love well, in my opinion. It's frustrating. So like I couldn't get that, but like I find myself very the characters I like the most were like Kelsier and Breeze. And if you're a fan of Breeze, we get a lot of Breeze later. Breeze is wonderful. So this is a 5 for me because I could not wait. I remember recommending this to because we had just come back from my daughter's birthday and referring it to her young friend who'd come on the trip with us. Because you can refer this to young teens. It's fine. It's harmless. And she stormed through it. And then she recommended it to a friend. And this is just an easy book to recommend. It's an easy book to get into the Cosmere universe. It's where you should start, I think. And great, just overall fantasy book.
Yeah, I would agree. This is a solid read, and I heartily agree that you should encourage other people to read this.
Thank you again for watching. For all of you who've newly subscribed, we hope we've convinced you to read Mistborn. We hope you'll tune in for Gunmetal Gods. And we hope you join our sort of book club and join our Discord. Follow us on Twitter where you can read along with us.
Yeah, thank you again for all the new subscribers and the viewers, especially for the last episode. Every little bit helps, so thanks again. We appreciate it.
All right, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, join us next week. Thanks for watching.